Welcome, everybody, to the Eat, Pray, Faith podcast with Dr. Tracey Straub, ND. That is me. And I'm so glad you're joining me today because today we are going to talk about stuff in vaccines. And I'm not talking about the big bad C vaccine that's been out, I don't know, for the past, as they say, 3.5 years, but particularly the childhood vaccine schedule. Now, this podcast is not meant to insult, shame anyone. It is to give you informed consent that you should be given at every pediatrician visit that you're probably not privy to for a few reasons. One, I truly don't think many pediatricians know what are in childhood vaccinations. Number two, they just blindly do what they're taught and instructed to do. And number three, we don't ask. And if you don't ask, no one has to tell you. So I want you to take from this today an educated decision for your family. This is, again, not to make anyone feel condemned or guilty. I know my personal stance on childhood vaccines, but in all honesty, I see a lot of people in my clinic, along with the practitioners who work in my telehealth company. And we see a lot of children that are fully vaccinated and children that are not fully vaccinated. We do not reject anyone or turn anyone away. We all come to our state of understanding, knowledge, and wisdom, through time. So if you're listening to this and you still vaccinate your children, that's totally fine. Please stay tuned so you can find out what is being injected and how those particular injections work. Also, if you don't, stay tuned and feel free to share this with somebody so that you can help them. So there are certain states that have exemptions to vaccinations. I'll just start with that to say that I'm not an attorney. I don't know the laws of all states. So what I would suggest is I'm going to post a link in the details of this podcast. Take a look at your state and see if there is a medical, religious, or strong philosophical exemption. And if so, what are the bylaws of submission for exemption to your schools and particular activities? I happen to live in the state of Pennsylvania. And so we do have a medical, religious, and philosophical exemption on the website for the CDC. You can go there to the cdc.gov, Pennsylvania, and you can download the exemption form and sign it as a parent. You do not need a medical advisor. You do not need a pastor. You simply need your little John Hancock on that form and hand it in. And that is a legal document protecting your rights as protected by the Pennsylvania Constitution of the United States. So moving into stuff in vaccines, and I think everything that I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to post the details to the actual study and or CDC and or FDA document where you can look at these particular ingredients. But first to say that vaccines are biologics, not drugs. And as a biologic, they're going to contain certain components, DNA in nature, that are going to influence the body. So I just want to go through very quickly, what are some of the concerns that parents have with the childhood vaccine schedule? Number one, they're not subject to the same level of safety testing as pharmaceuticals. And I think we saw that during the pandemic where the vaccine was rushed out to market. Nowhere in time would that ever be allowed, ever. These are patents on these childhood vaccinations. And so when you have a patent, you don't necessarily have to tell people what's in your patent because it's top secret, it's closed. The National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act, which is called NCVIA, which was formed out of the 1986 Act, which its purpose was to eliminate the potential financial liability of vaccine manufacturers due to vaccine injury claims. And this was in order to ensure a stable market supply of vaccines and to provide cost-effective arbitration for vaccine injury claims. So many people have heard of the 1986 Act, but if you haven't, let me give you a really quick summation of what it is and why it was established. During 1986, there was a big kind of scare with Ebola, and President Reagan was the president at the time. And at the time, the DTaP vaccine, which was out, a lot of the vaccine manufacturers were being sued. And there was a lady named Barbara Jo Fisher who was a big advocate for safer vaccinations. Long story short, during this whole crisis, they wanted an Ebola vaccine for this upcoming scare. And the vaccine manufacturers were just not willing to do that. They basically said, hey, we're being sued too much on this DTaP vaccine. And there's a really great synopsis of this whole story in Dr. Andrew Wakefield's movie, 1986, The Act. So I'm going to link that in the details of this podcast as well, because I would advise that you use it, especially if this is the first time you're hearing all of this. He does a really great job of laying it out in very common speak. It helps parents understand what happened during the 1986 Act, how all liability was removed from these manufacturers. And just so you understand what that means, it means if you owned a company and you manufactured a product and somebody bought the product, took the product, and got injured or died from the product, when they took the liability off of you as the manufacturer, nobody could sue you. So basically, you can have a product that's out in the market that can be harming people that nobody can do anything about. And so the 1986 Act, which was the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act, NCVIA, basically took liability off of the manufacturers of these childhood vaccinations. And this was because the vaccine manufacturers wouldn't produce this Ebola vaccine because they knew it was a dangerous vaccine. They knew this Ebola vaccine was an mRNA vaccine, and they were like, hey, it's probably going to injure people and we don't want to be sued. So President Reagan signed into executive order this Childhood Vaccine Injury Act, and it basically did three things. Number one, it removed all liability from the vaccine manufacturers of childhood vaccines. So that was first. So nobody could sue them, nobody could do anything if their child was injured. And because of that, they were like, well, we're going to need a place where parents can report injuries and also maybe get money if there is an injury, because they knew vaccines caused injury, but they didn't want the whole world to know that. So they established what was called VAERS, the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, which was established by the government and funded by your tax dollars to pay out any damages to parents that would claim an injury. So that was another thing that happened from the 1986 Act. So you had no liability on manufacturers. This court that was established because they knew vaccines caused injuries, and they had to give a place that parents could go report the injury, and or physicians, which is what it was for. But my good friend Ashley Grogg does a whole class. Again, I'm going to post her class in the notes if you're a provider, and she teaches providers how to report to VAERS if they suspect a vaccine injury, because it's extremely difficult. And then in that reporting, there were two types of injuries. Number one was called on-table injuries, and the second group was called off-table injuries. The on-table injuries were the injuries they knew. And initially, in the 1986 Act, there was a wide list of injuries that they knew were caused by vaccines. And if a parent reported an injury that was considered an on-table injury, they would be paid out immediately, no court hearing necessary. Then there were off-table injuries, and these were injuries that the parents had to go and improve. And so they had to go to this VAERS court, they had to stand in front of a judge, and they had to actually prove that these injuries were caused by the vaccine. So on-table and off-table, according to the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System and the government established court to pay damages. Through time, they left a little caveat in the 1986 Act. It said whoever was in charge at the time could red pen out the on-table injuries if they couldn't prove they were related to vaccine, or if they could prove they were related to damage from something else. And so as of today, I think there's only one or two on-table injuries that parents get paid out for, and several on-table injuries that they try to claim that they never see anything for. So it was kind of a sneaky little way to discredit parents of children that have vaccine injury. And then the third caveat was that this 1986 Act was supposed to keep these vaccine manufacturers um, basically under control so that they just didn't create anything. And so they were supposed to do safety tests every 2 years, according to the NIH and the National Institute of Health, but that never happened. So there was a court case that was taken to the Supreme Court level, and I believe it was Robert Kennedy that was involved with that. And they won at the Supreme Court level that vaccine manufacturers could not claim vaccines as safe and effective because they have never, ever done the safety testing according to the caveat set and the precedent set by the 1986 Act. So there you have it. Liability was taken off manufacturers. They knew that vaccines caused injury, so they created a reporting system and a court to pay out injuries. And then they were supposed to do safety tests, which they never did. And so, because of that, to this date, there's been over $4.6 billion paid out due to vaccine injury claims. And that's an estimate based on only 1% of people reporting because the VAERS system is so very complicated. So, parents, I want you to understand this is not made up. I want you to understand if you're a practitioner and you're listening to this for the first time, please do your due diligence and research all this. You don't have to trust Tracey. You have to trust what is out there in the court system, what's already into law. And you should go and be an advocate for information, not right or wrong, but information. So to date, there's about 36 vaccines, 35 ingredients mixed into the concoction per vaccine, not one safety test done in combination of other vaccines. So that's like taking, the MMR, DTaP, flu, Coxsackie, and putting those all together and saying, okay, if we give all these to a kid throughout life, what does this look like in the long run? There's no tests like that. There's no safety studies like that by the government agencies. Now, there was a longitudinal clinical trial done on children that were unvaccinated, and the results were unbelievable. No chronic disease, no allergies, no antibiotics before age of 3. Like the health of the children that were completely unvaccinated surpassed by leaps and bounds the children that were vaccinated. And most of the kids that were unvaccinated and what we vaccinate for, such as chicken pox. I mean, when I was little, we had chicken pox parties. I mean, some of the things that we're vaccinating for are just ridiculous. And everybody worries about polio and what about polio? And if you understood at the time that the polio epidemic was happening, then you would know that they were spraying DDT on African American people because they considered them dirty. And they were also spraying DDT just on kids because they thought it was helpful. And so you had a lot of neurological issues and breathing issues that resembled polio. And then they actually had a dirty batch of the polio vaccine by Jonas Salk, who knew, and they actually hid that information because they didn't want people to distrust the vaccine schedule. And so over 100,000 children were affected by this dirty vaccine, which they knew was going out. It was a contaminated live virus, and they knew it. And many children died, and thousands became paralyzed. And so what you'll see through history is most of the diseases in which we vaccinate for were eradicated prior to the vaccine coming out, which is normal. A virus hits, a certain population of people. We see that it affects a lot of people, and then as the body's natural immunity takes it out. So there's not one safety test done in combination with all the ingredients. So if there's 35 ingredients per vaccine and they just mix it all up in this tube, they've never done a safety test on how do those ingredients interact with each other, which I thought was interesting. So no study done on the combination of the 36 vaccines and no safety study done on the intermixing of the 35 ingredients in every vaccine. So there's only ever been one vaccine that was tested for safety, and I put that, and one ingredient tested for safety, and both of those are now off the market. Isn't that funny? Because they couldn't prove them safe. Smallpox vaccine gone because it, well, killed people. And I think it's important that we realize when a vaccine disappears, it's probably because they realized it's not safe and effective. So, safety concerns are further compounded when we consider that infants and young children commonly receive multiple vaccines during the same office visit. And I have to ask you something for your consideration. When's the last time you got exposed to multiple different viral strains at one time in the form in your blood? So, measles, mumps, and rubella all at the same time. I mean, it's just ridiculous what we do to these kids. A perfectly beautiful, formed in the womb, spoken into existence before the foundations of the earth, called by name by God, born child, healthy, beautiful, has everything it needs. It comes out of the vaginal canal if it's natural, if your doctor's not trying to get to a golf tee off, and it gets all that beautiful probiotic base all over the baby. What do? The nurses wash it, and then they throw antibiotics in the baby's eyes. I mean, guys, we have to think about these archaic practices that we're doing. Why do we think that a mother has a disease that we need to throw antibiotics in a baby's eye? That was from decades ago when there were prostitutes having children, and we just had a different era of poor sanitation. So let's just think through these archaic practices. Birth is not a medical condition. It's done in a hospital now because that's the way we've been programmed to think, because everyone's scared to trust their bodies in every single way. So if you're a mom, just know that you do not have to give your child the hepatitis and vitamin K. I mean, hepatitis B vaccine at birth, excuse me, but when is a drug user going to be around your baby at birth, where you would have hepatitis B exposure? Again, an archaic practice that somehow got put into the vaccine schedule and no one questioned it. Vitamin K is for circumcision, so the baby doesn't bleed. But God's natural way, which is why in the Jewish culture, they didn't circumcise the baby until day 8 because vitamin K levels naturally come up over a week's time in the baby. So you do not have to have your baby circumcised in the hospital if you do not want to. It can be done later or not at all. So again, just thinking through these things. So we have multiple attenuated viruses at one time thrown into a baby with a perfectly beautiful immune system on its own, given to it by God. You have a full, complete reset of the baby's methylation pathway. That's the baby's ability to repair cells and detoxify. And we stick all of this junk into the bloodline, not even through the mouth or nose, which is God's natural immunity. So you have two paths of immunity. You have innate immunity and adaptive immunity. And I'm going to tell you, injection is much different than ingestion. So when you ingest something, take it in, breathe it in, swallow it, it goes through your innate immunity. And so what happens is you have intracellular and extracellular NK cells, intracellular phagocytes, extracellular. This is part of your innate immunity that comes in, makes sure it destroys all pathogens. You have mucus that encapsulated. You have all of these different things in your body, such as good bacteria, probiotics that fight for you. And even before your body creates an antibody, your body's already identifying through God's fingerprint of who you are, what is you and what's not you. So God's natural pathway of immunity is nose, mouth, digestion, lungs, skin. All of that is part of your innate immunity. And if you think about it, we have a repressant for all of those. Like you have a cough suppressant and an allergy suppressant. Everything that's innate, that's identifying you versus non-you, that gives you a sign, a cough, a sneeze, an itch. Guys, that's innate immunity. But what do? We squash it. But that's natural. That's God-given immunity. So viruses and bacteria should come in that way because God, who is a way maker, has created a way that your body will take it out. So instead, we don't trust that, and we go to the adaptive immunity where we're circumventing God's natural design for immunity and injecting attenuated viruses, dumbed down viruses, contaminants, adjuvants, excipients, all kinds of DNA from animals, bacteria and viruses from animals, just junk into our baby's bloodstream. And so the body really doesn't know how to navigate this as well as if it was naturally occurring through the mouth, nose, skin, lungs, etc. So it's just something to think about, okay? All right. So we know injection is different than ingestion. Super important that we keep that point because innate immunity is valuable and needed in order to keep the adaptive response in check. So now we've circumvented that. We've injected something directly into the blood. And according to the Bible, God says the life is in the blood, and we don't really have a balancer. So in these vaccinations, there are certain things that they put in them besides the attenuated virus that you never are informed about. You're never informed about what they do in the body. So they do have things called adjuvants, which is an ingredient used in some vaccines that helps create a stronger immune response in the people receiving the vaccine. So it's not just the attenuated virus, but also these adjuvants. And so these stronger immune responses are not always balanced because, again, we don't have the innate immune response happening. And then you have things called excipients, which, in addition to weakened or killed disease antigens, which is that attenuated virus, vaccines contain very small amounts of other ingredients called excipients. Now, when something is a small amount, it doesn't always have to be studied because it's not the main component. It's kind of like the other ingredients on a label. So the way they get around safety testing these things is they make them at the level or lower than the level that's accepted. But when you do that for 100 ingredients, when you say it's like 2% of this or that, but there's 40 things in there that are 2% of this or that, that's 80%. So just think about it because it's a lot. And so these can be preservatives, these can be adjuvants themselves. And the preservatives are to prevent contamination with inside the vaccine. Thimerosal, which is mercury, is a preservative. Now, I don't know about you, but when I was a kid, we used to evacuate a classroom when mercury got spilled on the floor, but I guess it's okay to inject into a child. Adjuvants, these help stimulate a stronger immune response, as I said, things like aluminum salts, stabilizers to keep the vaccine potent during the transportation and storage. So these are things like sugar and gelatin, which we're going to talk about all these. And then there's residual amounts, as they say, of other materials that are used during the manufacturing process. These are cell culture materials, and cell culture materials help grow the vaccine. So we're talking about MRC5 or aborted fetal tissue, egg protein. There's also inactivating ingredients used to kill viruses or inactive toxins like formaldehyde, which is, I don't know, they use it in embalming. And then antibiotics, which we know that, if you try to avoid antibiotics as a parent because you know the massive overuse of them, we're also injecting them into our children all the time, every time you go to a well visit, which, by the way, is an oxymoron. Why are you taking your kid to the doctor if they're well? So if they're not sick, what are you going to the doctor for? It just doesn't make any sense to me unless it's just a vaccine visit. So why don't they just call it what it is? It's a vaccine visit. So, all right. So when you have these adjuvants, excipients injected inside the body through a needle into the blood with no innate immune balancing, what's your body really responding to? And so let's just discuss all of these little things we talked about. Let's first talk about thimerosal. So because thimerosal is dangerous, and we know that it's a neurotoxin, mercury is a neurotoxin. So that's what thimerosal is. It's mercury. We are meant to believe that thimerosal was eliminated from all vaccines, but that's not true. It's in some of the flu shots, including some given to women that are pregnant and infants. The tetanus toxoid vaccine, meningitis. So there's more than 80 studies compiled by the Children's Health Defense, which is a great resource for you guys to go find out things that show the health effects of human exposure to mercury, including cognitive difficulties such as autism, memory, vision loss, coordination issues, tremors, skin rashes, mood instability, etc. So I think a lot of people look at vaccines and they look at the metals because they know, and I'm going to talk about this later, like how does a vaccine really break down the human body for some kids? And guys, this is a drug, it's a pharmaceutical product, it's a biologic. There are going to be people that react to it, and for people to say it's for the greater good, who says things like that? People that don't have a vaccine injured child. People whose child didn't get injured by a vaccine say those things. But I promise you, they would no longer say it's for the greater good if their child was the one sacrificed. So we need to have a level of compassion for these parents. And I think after the pandemic, after all of that came out, there was there was a greater emphasis on understanding what am I injecting into my children, because you know what? Adults didn't want something injected into their body, but they continue to sacrifice their children to the altar of Baal, right? Because they think somehow they're protecting their child. From what? From viruses and bacteria that don't exist, from extremely easily curable things such as measles. I mean, measles, really, it's a vitamin A deficiency. Use some vitamin A, it takes care of it. So I just want you guys to understand there's studies out there showing that vitamin A can overcome a measles infection. This is not new. This is science. You want science? Go find the other science because I promise you it's out there. Let's talk about the aluminum in vaccines. Actually, there's 4 types of aluminum in vaccines. They don't tell you that. These things are not regulated. There's no level that's regulated. Remember, these are patented products, so they don't have to tell you what's in it. They don't have to tell you, mom or dad, what they're putting in this thing. They can put anything they want in there. It's a patent. So aluminum gels or salts, these are added as adjuvants to help the vaccine stimulate a better immune response, i.e. be more effective. But here's the thing, we know that vaccines aren't safe and effective because they've never proven them as such. But without aluminum, more doses of the vaccine might be required. So what they did was they put in aluminum so there would be less vaccines required, but now you're adding a toxic metal. And this is one that we are exposed through food, air, water, and its natural occurrence in the earth crust. But here's the kicker. By the time a child receives the entire schedule of the childhood vaccines, they have over 12,000 micrograms given of aluminum. So I want you to understand at that level, it can be and is a toxin for that child. Heavy metals destroy adenosine triphosphate, which is ATP. And they accomplish this by binding to one or more of the reactive groups, which means mitochondria will not regenerate, cells won't split adequately, you don't recover. And so ATP is extremely important. We need it to supply us energy, and aluminum is going to be one of those things that destroys it. Additionally, aluminum has been studied in Alzheimer's, so go look that up. And I just want you guys to understand that it's not one thing that creates the downfall of health. It's the voluntary suicide that we do every day, where we're eating poorly, sleeping poorly, moving poorly, thinking poorly, and then voluntarily injecting things into our blood. It's just a perfect storm. All right, let's talk about mercury. Again, when I was in school, if this spilled on the ground, we were evacuating the classroom. But mercury is a metal. It's liquid at room temperature and has 3 highly toxic forms. Elemental, that's mercury in liquid or vapor. There's compounds of organic salts, and then there's organometallics. So mercury can enter the body by a number of different methods: inhalation, ingestion, and absorption right through the skin. That's the organomercury. So mercury ions produce toxic effects by protein precipitation. They inhibit enzymes, and enzymes are catalysts in your body, guys, that create biological reactions that we need. And they're generally corrosive by action. So mercury binds to sulfahydryl groups, and phosphorus groups, carbon groups, amine groups, proteins, including enzymes. So there's a lot of different ways that mercury hijacks pathways in your body. And once these things are bound to mercury, most proteins are just rendered inactive. Now, what do proteins do in the body? Well, they break down into amino acids, and amino acids are like the vowels of your communication. And so when your body's trying to communicate from one cell to another, one receptor to another, without vowels in the words, it doesn't really make sense. So heavy metals in vaccines can be an issue for some kids. Am I saying they're the cause of anything? No. I'm saying for some children, there can be injury, which is why, according to the government, there is a vaccine injury court that to date has paid over $4.6 billion of your tax money to vaccine injured children. All right, antibiotics. These are added to prevent growth of germs during the production and storage of vaccines. So there's been debates over the risks of exposing kids to antibiotics too early in life, but there are studies out there that found that multiple antibiotic use in early childhood can lead to weight gain, increased bone growth, and altered gut bacteria. Well, these are things we know. I mean, these are things we know, guys. This is no surprise for us. Injecting them into the blood, there's a whole new way. So we've seen increased food allergies due to destruction of your good gut bacteria, just probiotic balance in general. And for every cell you have in your body, you have 10 times the probiotics. 10 times pro meaning for, biotic meaning life, for life, good bacteria in your body given to you by God, so specific to you that it's like your fingerprint. Nobody has the same microbiota you do. And so when we're injecting vaccines and we're injecting antibiotics and we're giving antibiotics and we're giving antibiotics to our animal population and so on and so forth, our body is assaulted every day. And so here's the thing that I'm going to give every parent right now. There is one probiotic that is passed from mama to baby during birth. It's Bifidobacteria infantis. And only 7% of moms actually give that, are able to pass it to the baby. I'm going to link that in the comments. And one of the things that I want you to do is grab that for your kids, even if you have them on that for only a month, because every child should take it and need it. It's one of the main repopulators. It creates the methylation process. And if you have a child that was a C-section, you have a child that has some spectrum issues, you have a child that has any type of issues with skin, brain, pain, inflammation, name it. This is a great probiotic for your child to be on. No harm, no foul. It's a probiotic. We all should have it. We all didn't get it. So just think about that. And if you're from the generation that wasn't breastfed, you should definitely take it. So I'll link that here in the details of the podcast. Check it out. Very important. All right, egg protein. So flu vaccines are actually the most commonly made using egg-based manufacturing process to make both the inactive vaccine, the flu shot, and the live attenuated vaccine, usually called the nasal spray. The yellow fever vaccine also is made this way, and you putting anyone with an egg allergy at risk to receive these vaccines. And yes, we are seeing people that are sensitive to egg whites, egg yolks. I mean, you can't inject a foreign protein into the blood and not expect your body to make an antibody against it. And so we talk about this a lot with leaky gut in natural health, that if stuff is leaking out through the tight junctions in the digestive system into the blood, it looks like a foreign protein, an antigen, and your body is going to make an antibody against it. Well, if you inject a foreign protein into the blood, your body's going to make an antibody against it. So when we talk about antibody production and effectiveness of vaccines, they don't measure what the antibody is against. They just measure that there's antibodies in the blood. It could be against the egg, it could be against the aluminum, it could be against anything except the virus. So injection, it does not equate immunization. Vaccination is not immunization. It's a really important point. Just because you got a vaccine doesn't mean you're immune. How many women had to have their titers tested when they got pregnant for different things like measles, mumps, and rubella? And how many of you found out you don't have any immunity to it? That's because vaccination is not immunization. All right. So these can enhance food sensitivities due to that foreign antigen in the bloodstream. And as I said, what is the body actually creating an antibody against? There's also pathogens in eggs, like avian coronavirus, IBV, that infects birds. Now, when they do the quality control list, they don't check for avian coronavirus. So this affects the reproductive system of kidneys, it affects the respiratory tract, the gut, all of that. And so avian coronavirus is responsible for substantial economic loss with the poultry industry. And now we're injecting pathogens that are animal pathogens into humans. And what is that going to do long term? What's going to happen when we start injecting these things into ourselves? Most likely, what's going to happen is that we're going to see antibodies being made against these weird viruses that are not supposed to be in our human bodies. So, next one, formaldehyde. This is added to vaccines to kill unwanted bacteria and viruses that might contaminate the vaccine during production. And we know that formaldehyde is a human carcinogen. MSG, monosodium glutamate. This is more known as a food additive, but it's also used as a stabilizer to help vaccines remain unchanged when they're exposed to heat, light, acidity, or humidity. MSG consumption is notorious for causing headaches in people, can also cause fatigue, disorientation, heart palpitations, and according to the Mayo Clinic, MSG has been called an excitotoxin, which is usually a term used to describe a class of chemicals, usually amino acids, that overstimulate neuron receptors in the brain. And that overstimulation causes those neuron receptors to die. And so over time, you can't lose a bunch of neuron receptors. It's really important that we keep our brain healthy. So, next one, squalene. So, according to the who you say, the World Health Organization, squalene is a component of some adjuvants, and it's added to vaccines to enhance the immune system response. So, it's a naturally occurring substance, and it's usually derived primarily from shark liver oil. It's also found in food, cosmetics, over-the-counter medications, and supplements. Not as much supplements anymore because I think we got wiser to the matter. And if you do see it in supplements, don't buy those. But when it's combined with other ingredients, it actually becomes an adjuvant like aluminum. So it's added to vaccines to like elicit this stronger immune response to the body. Also, the World Health Organization notes that most people who have received squalene containing vaccines are in older age groups, and that we don't really know how this component might impact younger people. I mean, they just don't know. So, a 2000 study found that a single injection of squalene adjuvant produced arthritis in rats. And although more research is needed, many believe that squalene containing anthrax vaccine to be the main culprit triggering the Gulf War syndrome. So that was interesting. American troops who served in the Persian Gulf War in the early 1990s had to receive this. And so there was a big thing written. I think there's a book called Vaccine A, as in the letter A, that you can read. Go check that out. So gelatin, here's one thing. I mean, gelatin is made from the hooves of animals, and most of these animals, cows, pigs, are eating corn-laden food. I mean, it's very rare that we grass feed our animals, and if we do grass feed them, it's alfalfa and it's genetically modified. So whatever's in the animal is going to go into the children. And I hear a lot of people talk about glyphosate, which is a huge chelator, and chelate means to strip minerals from the body. It's also a highly poisonous herbicide, It affects the shikimate pathway, and the shikimate pathway is in plants. And they basically said, since humans don't have a shikimate pathway, it's safe for us to consume. Well, guess what has a shikimate pathway? Your microbiome, your probiotics. So glyphosate can hijack the glycine pathway in methylation, and that's just an amino acid pathway that is essential for detoxification. So this is commonly used gelatin that is taken from animals fed genetically modified and glyphosate-laden foods is used in vaccines. It's made by boiling the skin and connective tissue down, typically from a pig, but it's a stabilizer. And it's to protect the virus in the vaccines from any like heat, light, etc. So it's a concerning additive, because some people do have gelatin allergies, but also because it's a glyphosate source. Plus, let's just not even talk about kosher when it comes to religious concerns for Jews. That when they require a Jewish person who's kosher to inject this into their children, it's a violation of their religious rights, which are protected by the Constitution of the United States. So y'all need to do better if you're going to make these vaccines and stop violating human rights. The same. So if you didn't know that and you're of the Jewish heritage, well, now you do. Again, glyphosate source. So, the government's just coming in and stepping all over not only your health, but your religious exemptions as well. Let's talk about bovine products or cow stuff in vaccines. You have albumin, calf serum, bovine extract, acids from cows, and fetal bovine syndrome. Now, in order to get the serum out of a baby calf, the calf has to be alive, and they have to puncture the calf's chest with a tube and stick it right into the calf's heart. Doesn't that sound great? Doesn't that sound humane and wonderful? But they don't care. They're just going to poke a baby calf in the heart to get the serum out so that they can put it into vaccines. And it's in all DTaP, all polio, all MMR, all rabies, all hepatitis A, and all Varivax, Zostavax. So just so you're aware, that bovine serum is in there, and it's a very cruel, inhumane process to extract the serum. Polysorbate 80. This is in the human papillomavirus vaccine, HPV, which is the highest reaction vaccine on the market. I think we were up to a 40% reaction to this vaccine. It's a stabilizer. It's an emulsifier. It's also used in food and cosmetics. The safety of using this chemical in vaccines has been so poorly studied, and according to the material safety data sheet, which is MSDS, for polysorbate 80, it can cause adverse reproductive effects and cancer based on animal testing. The MSDS also indicates that no safety testing has ever been done on humans. Now, during your teenage years of your children, boys and girls, you're injecting polysorbate 80 into your children in the HPV vaccine. And let me tell you this, toll-like receptors in your body already have a way of taking out human papillomavirus. I want you to understand that conversations about safe sex, maybe no sex, abstinence, is important. And with that said, there's no reason to inject HPV vaccine into your children when there has been no safety study done on polysorbate 80, which might cause reproductive effects, infertility, and or cancer, which they're trying to prevent. I mean, talk about an oxymoron. Aborted human fetal tissue. Now, this has been a big controversy because everyone's like, there's no aborted fetal tissue. This is what the vaccine is grown in. So you have it grown in human tissue because that's what it has to be grown in, the attenuated virus. There's a number of vaccines, including varicella, rubella, hepatitis A, shingles, rabies, that are made using fetal embryo cells. This is called MRC5 on some of the vaccines, and it has been for decades. And the reason that's given is viruses tend to grow better in these cells, and the fetal cells can divide for a long time before dying. So if a cell is dividing, it's alive, just saying. However, the use of actual fetal cells poses the question of how the fetal DNA will interact with the virus. So you have a fetal DNA and a virus. Eventually, the human into which it's injected, how does that DNA of those cells affect the human? So this remains unclear. And it's kind of dangerous to the immune response because you're like mixing a DNA concoction. So, in the years when vaccines were grown in human fetal cells was introduced, there was a rise in autism, and that's according to the Sound Choice Pharmaceutical Institute. These are things that you need to know. And I'm going to come back to that because there was a study on this. So, some of the cell lines in the disease, MDCK, that year it was dog kidney. That's a dog kidney that's in your flu cell vax that was approved in 2016. So you're injecting dog kidney cells into your children. Vero, which is African green monkey kidney, that was done in 1962, and that's in the polio vaccine. RA27 3, which is approved in 1964, is a human kidney cell that's in your rubella fraction and in your MMR. WI 38, which is a human lung, that was approved in 1965. It's in Varivax and rubella. MRC5 was approved in 1970. That's a human lung cell line. Varivax, Havrix, Vacta, Twinrix, rabies, shingles, and smallpox, which gone. PER.C.6, which is retina cells, which was in the experimental Ebola and HIV, that was 1985. And Buculovirus, 2013, approved. This was from armyworm, weird, and Spondoptera frugiperta, whatever that is, Spodoptera frugiperda. That's in the flu block that was approved in 2014. So multiple cell lines of different kinds of animals. These are just some of them, not all of them, to know that when God created everything in its own kind, he didn't say inject cell lines of other animals into your blood. Just saying. So there was a letter from Dr. Teresa Dizer. She was a PhD on human DNA in vaccines in April of 2019. She said, administration of fragments of human non-self DNA to a child can generate an immune response that can cross-react with the child's own DNA. Injecting children with human fetal DNA contaminant risks of causing two well-established pathological issues. Number one, autoimmune disease. Foreign fetal human DNA triggers an immune response, leading the immune system to attack his or her own body. Second issue, insertional mutagenesis, which means the fetal human DNA inserts or incorporates itself into the child's DNA. Listen to this again. The fetal human DNA in the vaccine incorporates itself or inserts into the child's DNA, causing mutations. Gene therapy using as little as 1.9 nanograms per milliliter of DNA fragments results in 100% insertion into genomes of injected mice. 100%. The level of human fetal DNA fragments in the MMR, Varivax, which is chickenpox, and hepatitis A vaccines contains much more than vaccines 1.9 nanograms per milliliter. So basically what she's saying is when you inject the DNA of other children into your children, it inserts itself. Dr. Teresa Dizer. The presence of both high-level contaminating fetal DNA as well as the presence of human endogenous retrovirus K, HERC-VK, in the MMR vaccine is an unstudied risk with huge implications and dangers for the individual and public health. There is evidence of HERV VK retrovirus activation in ovarian cancer, melanoma, breast, prostate, lymphomas, leukemias, and sarcomas. So, Corvelva Laboratories exposed HERV-K and Gardasil, your HPV virus. Dr. Teresa Dizer exposed HERV-K and MMR. Are we seeing ovarian cancer, melanoma, breast, prostate, lymphomas, leukemia, and sarcomas? Yes, we are, and we are seeing these things in children. Just know that DNA doesn't stay stable. It's insertional. And if you're injecting it from a child, and let's talk about that Italian study. So the Italian study, what triggered this study was a law that was passed in 2017 by the Italian government mandating childhood vaccination. The law was opposed by Corvelva, an advocacy group of independent researchers that had been demanding freedom to choose vaccines since 1993. On October 26, 2018, the Italian National Order of Biologists, known as ONB, a 50,000 member association, announced a grant of $11,350,000 to Corvelva to undertake the study, which gave credibility to the protests and the study against this law passed by the Italian government. So these results were not published by any peer-reviewed journal, but the findings were true and quite alarming. According to this study, they found a full genome of a human boy and a full genome of a human girl in vaccines, which means insertional mutagenesis, where the DNA of these children inserts to your children's DNA, according to Dr. Teresa Dizer, creating all these issues. I do believe it was Dr. Peter McCullough that was concerned about the incredible explosion of transgenderism we're seeing. Now, remember, after 1996 is when the vaccine schedule changed, right? 1986 was when the vaccine manufacturers lost all liability. 1996 was when we saw the induction of glyphosate in genetically modified products. And we don't know what are in these vaccines, and there's no safety studies. I just want you to think about what you're injecting into your children. Because if you know better, you can do better. So, again, we went through the ingredients in vaccines. Some of them, there are more. I'll post the link. You can go look yourself. But I want you guys to understand that when you're taking your child into the pediatrician's office, which, by the way, pediatricians were only established around 1939. You don't have to have a pediatrician for your child. You don't have to have a pediatrician for your child. I'm just going to say that again. You've been brainwashed to think that. I have nothing against the medical field. I think the medical physicians have the same goal that I do, which is health. They want you to feel better. But I think the system is broken. I don't think parents receive informed consent. I don't think practitioners are educated on what is in vaccines. I know that there's no studies on the combination of vaccines through a lifetime, nor is there studies on the combination of the concoction in the needle. So it's really important that we as parents do the research. So there are states that have exemptions. If you want to start looking at that, there are freedom groups in your area. Start to look them up, talk to people, get involved. Do not let the government take your freedoms of choice as a parent. Stay involved with your legislators. Make phone calls. Send emails. It's important. You don't just sit back because your voice matters as much as anybody else's. So what happens when your child receives a vaccine? For some kids, well, it breaks down methylation. We know that. And especially if your child has some sort of issue with MTHFR, methyl-tetrahydrofolate reductase gene mutation, where your child can't really methylate well anyway. And that just means repair new and healthy cells and detoxify well. And over time, you're throwing all of this stuff into a child that can't detoxify well, and it builds up and they can't repair well. And so they get what's called a damaged associated molecular pattern. And so all of their cells eventually become sick. And that can lead to many avenues of chronic disease. You also have this unnatural exposure to multiple viruses at one time and multiple toxicities in the blood at a very young level. And there's no variation on the vaccines from your baby to a 150-pound adult. A flu shot is a flu shot. They don't care. Nor are they liable. And nor can you do anything if your child gets damaged. You're going to have to go report it to the vaccine adverse reporting system, VAERS. And if you're lucky, you might get something. So again, this is no judgment if you vaccinate and you need help with your child and you think perhaps something that's going on with your child as a result of that. Reach out to us. I'll put the link to the telehealth group. You're welcome to reach out with a practitioner. We will come in and support you. We will pray with you. We will make sure that you understand that there is a path that you can take to help support your child through this process. If you want some other resources, Dr. Sherry Tenpenny is a great resource. She has a Substack, she has a podcast, she has a website, and she is probably I would say, the original gangster of coming out as a physician and saying, we have to do better with these vaccines, something's wrong. Dr. Suzanne Humphreys, she just redid her book called Dissolving Illusions. Great book. So get that book. It's updated. She talks about this. She did a really great interview with the Epoch Times. So make sure you catch her. Children's Health Defense, another one, a great resource. There's so many out there, and I'll try to list them in the details of this podcast so that you have a place and a space where you can research for your children, because I know you love your kids as much as I love my kids, and we're all just doing our best. But when we know better, we can do better. Just know that your kids were given to you as a gift from God, and you're in a covenant to protect them here. Just make sure you do your due diligence to do the best you can. So God bless you. Thank you for tuning in. All of the links will be in the details of this podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. Remember, there is stuff in vaccines that we don't necessarily want in our bodies. So make an educated decision for your children and family. God bless.